Bring in John Desjarlais. John, you work with Indigenous workers and employers and businesses. What has really made the difference in terms of community buy-in for developments? Is there a shift away from that kind of paternalistic attitude to one, as Professor Young was talking about, of respect and trust, and mutual respect and trust?
Absolutely. First, I'd like to acknowledge I'm on the land of the Sami people, and so as an Indigenous person myself, I think that's appropriate and respectful. So thank you for having me as a guest. But yeah, to that question, the landscape is shifting. It's shifting in Canada, and it's shifting very rapidly. So Canada, built on the Indian Act, built on the Constitution and its relationship with Indigenous people, has certainly evolved to look at its relationships much differently, and especially in respect to resource development. And so jurisprudence says, and jurisprudence over the last 30 years says, challenging Indigenous communities is not good business. It's not good governance, and it's made for very ineffective policy. So that's the growing sentiment. So the shift now you see is, how do we treat Indigenous communities as partners? Not as stakeholders, not as someone where you're part of, or not as a community where you're part of a process, you check a box, you've effectively satisfied a process through consultation, but how do you bring the communities in? How do you look at the relationship more equitably? And there's a lot of catalysts that help, I think, drive that sentiment. Truth and Reconciliation in Canada was an incredible movement, and it was a discovery process. Canada is taking responsibility for its relationship with the Indigenous people, and then there's the reconciliation part. And so that is really the underlying theme to how do we develop these relationships more meaningfully. And so now, and there's a growing trend, which is increasing at a great rate, is how do we bring in Indigenous communities? And that's how do we bring them in from an ownership perspective? How do we get them engaged and part of their own part of the consultation process? Indigenous communities consulting Indigenous communities, because we've had such a challenge with it, because it was paternal, because it was other people managing the interests and the rights of Indigenous people. So ownership now, and governance and authority, and also regulatory. And so there's hundreds of examples in Canada where Indigenous communities are buying in. There's another complication as well too. Canada's relationship with Indigenous people didn't lend itself well to an economic boom or development of those communities because they didn't have a land base. We didn't have a land base. We didn't have the assets to be able to leverage, so debt financing and any type of acquisition was challenging. So now governments regionally and federally more recently is moving in that direction, but regionally governments are backstopping, providing loan guarantees to communities so that they can invest into these opportunities as well too. And so that's what's changing. It's more than less, how do we manage the relationship, but how do we participate in development with Indigenous communities as true equitable partners? How do we ensure regulatory efficiency without compromising on the integrity of the intent of the process? How do we move things along at a greater pace, meet world demand, but still do it sustainably, still do it in line with reciprocity, our relationship with the land, stewardship, conservatorship, not compromising on those things, but moving development along at the pace the world needs. And
well,
yes,
that's crucial, isn't it? Moving that development on at the pace that the world needs. And